Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on why engaged people power performance. We'll be joining the dots between performance management and employee engagement. This webinar is presented by ClearView, and I'm Dan Antisich, Head of Sales and Marketing here at ClearView. So we've had 600 people register for this, and I can see people joining quickly, so we're going to have a good few hundred people to get stuck into this topic today. For those of you who aren't familiar with ClearView, we're a UK headquartered performance and engagement software provider. Our mission is to enable individuals and teams to achieve what matters most to the organization and themselves. And how we go about that is by ensuring that every employee is motivated, supported, and clear on their priorities, with their achievements being recognized. Over the last 4 years, we've helped over 250 organizations make the shift to a more effective and engaging model of performance management, a model built on meaningful performance conversations and feedback. Feel free to get in touch with us afterwards for more information. Okay, a couple of things to be aware of as we go through the webinar today. Firstly, fear not, we will be sending out the slides and the recording of the webinar afterwards. And we'll also be sending out an ebook which contains a little bit more of the thinking that we'll be exploring within this webinar. And the second point is we're going to set aside some time to have a good question and answer session at the end. So could I encourage you please to make sure you log questions as we go through, don't save them up for the end, so that when we get there, we've got plenty of questions to get into. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the speakers today. We've got Stuart Hearn and Ian MacRae. So Stuart, CEO and founder of ClearView, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how it led to the conversation that we're having today?
Sure. So I've been in HR for over 20 years now. Originally, I worked in-house and latterly as international HR director at Sony Music, and then spent 8 years heading up a specialist performance and talent management consultancy. Now, over that time, I, being honest, witnessed far too many performance management and employee engagement activities that were really time consuming for HR, for managers and for staff, which had very little impact on the business and its employees, leading to frustration and cynicism from everyone involved. So that's what led me to start up ClearView back in 2015, as I saw a massive opportunity for organizations to reinvent performance management as a way of empowering employees to achieve more of what matters most, which is now our mission, and using technology as an enabler for that.
Great, thanks, Stuart. And Ian, obviously we at ClearView have been lucky enough to be working with you for some time now. And can you tell us a little bit about the academic research that you've done and what areas of workplace psychology you're particularly interested in?
Yeah, well, as a workplace psychologist, I'm really interested in performance and the data behind performance. So I want to know the kind of objective measures of how we can improve and develop performance. A lot of my earlier work has been in leadership, so looking at high potential and kind of potential and success in the long term. I've written 5 books on workplace psychology, so very focused on getting all the evidence and the information we can obtain to really develop and improve performance. And engagement has been the next logical step because it's a factor that's hugely related to individual performance in the workplace, and it's one of the things that we can improve.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we look forward to getting into some of that detail a little later. Before we pass on to Stuart to kick us off, we'd like to get going with a poll. So you can hopefully see the poll coming up in your screen now. We'd like to get an understanding of how often you do engagement surveys. So is it annually, is it twice a year, 3 or more times a year, or never? And there's a little bit of a delay on the line to the tune of about 10 seconds. So we'll just give this a little bit of time to come through.
Ian, you've been working in surveys for a long time in psychometrics and things. What have you seen in terms of the frequency of engagement? So.
Yeah, I think the frequency is going to be increasing a lot. I actually remember doing some engagement work in a hospital about 12 years ago, and at that time it was kind of completely new and different, and not a lot of people were doing it. So I expect there's been some good progress now. More people are doing it, but I think there's still a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I'm seeing both. I'm still seeing organizations very much firmly in the annual or even every 2 years, but with the advent of new technology, some people moving towards more of that ongoing assessment of engagement. So Dan, have we got the results ready to show?
Yeah, I think we can wrap the poll up there. And as you can see, it's 58% are on the annual side, and then just an even split between the twice a year, or 3 or more times a year, with the 13% have never actually managing to do the survey. So overwhelmingly, the annual engagement survey is still where things are at.
But progress being made in some organisations by the sounds of it. So.
Yeah, that's accurate. So, okay, well, I think, Stuart, I'll pass over to you to kick us off.
Sure. So I'd like to actually start by standing back from engagement a little bit and thinking about productivity. Why? Because in the UK, we've got a productivity problem. And here are 3 of the points that Andrew Haldane, the chief economist to the Bank of England, made in a speech on productivity in 2018. First, and most importantly, UK productivity has flatlined for a decade. And there's a gap between the UK's productivity and its main competitors. So, for example, the average French worker apparently achieves by Thursday lunchtime what the average British worker achieves only by the close of business on a Friday. And also the gap between the top and bottom performing 10% of companies is 80% larger in the UK than in our international competitors. So why does this matter? Well, because in the UK, we've got an increasing divide between economic growth and worker productivity, as you can see on this slide here. Now, when the economy is growing strongly, as it has done over the last 10 years, nobody really minds this too much. But when GDP growth starts to tail off, as it's starting to around the world, but specifically in the UK with concern around Brexit and uncertainty with that, then all eyes start to focus in on productivity again. And then where does it go after that? It focuses on employee performance. Now, we're starting to see this in survey data coming through. So last year, Clear Review commissioned a major performance management study involving hundreds of HR professionals and thousands of managers and employees. And it found that 92% of organizations said that performance management is a critical area they need to address in the next 12 to 18 months. So we need to up the ante on employee performance if we're going to tackle the productivity problem in the UK. Now, interestingly, our survey also found that organisations are becoming clearer on how we can improve employee performance. 92% said when they were thinking about the solution to performance management that more regular coaching conversations would benefit employee performance. But there's a missing piece here, because performance and development conversations are going to have limited effect if there are engagement issues affecting the employee that they're not bringing to the table, either because they're not conscious of them or because they don't know how to talk about them. So to address this, engagement and performance need to work together hand in hand. And we're going to be talking a little bit later on in the webinar what that actually looks like. But first, let's underline why employee engagement matters if we want to improve performance and productivity. Now, here are 3 key findings from a recent Gallup study on employee engagement. And it found that highly engaged business units see a 41% less absenteeism and 17% increase in productivity. Those same engaged business units achieve 10% increase in customer ratings and 20% increase in sales. So when we take those together, the net results of engagement in the workplace, according to Gallup, can equate to a 21% increase in profitability. So it's clear that high employee engagement is critical if we want to drive improvements in performance and productivity. Now, given the emphasis that's been placed on engagement over the last few years and the investments that organizations have been making, you think we'd expect to be seeing substantial improvements in engagement levels. But what we found from this chart, and this comes from the CIPD's latest employee outlook, which showed that job satisfaction over a 7-year period, which is one measure of engagement, has remained pretty stagnant in the UK, with the exception of the public sector. So clearly there's some major issues that are preventing organisations from successfully improving engagement. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from Ian to give his perspective from a psychological and scientific view on why some of these issues are happening and what's stopping engagement improving. But next, I think we're going to have our second audience poll before we do that. All right, Dan?
Yep, great, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so with that context from Stuart, we'd love to get an understanding of, from the population of the people on the call today, what the feeling is on this topic. So if you could go about filling that in, are your engagement scores trending upwards, remaining static, or trending downwards? So this will be an interesting one.
I'm really interested to see, because obviously we looked on the slide before about engagement, how it's gone over the years from a kind of across the UK perspective, but it'd be interesting to see whether the organisations on this call follow the norm for the UK, or whether we see a different kind of subset of data coming through here.
Yeah, because we may be getting people who are slightly more interested in engagement from the fact of you guys tuning in on the call.
Yeah, let's just give it another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so you should be able to see those results now. So, okay, quite an even split. So 33% trending upwards, with 49% remaining static.
Okay.
So that is the largest number, with an 18% trending downwards.
Okay. So take that on average, we're kind of, it's what the overall UK data is showing. It's kind of static on kind of average.
I think that's fair. Well done to the 33%, and let's see if we can help with that. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Ian, who's just going to unpack some of the details of employee engagement, some of the challenges in a little more detail.
Yeah, one of the challenges with engagement is really to make sure we're measuring the right thing. Because we see sometimes measures or questions about related to engagement that aren't necessarily measuring what we want them to be measuring. So from the psychological research, we've actually got a really clear picture of what engagement is. And I'm going to talk a bit about that later, but we know how to measure it, and we know how to use measures that are directly related to performance. And I'm going to present some data in a bit about what different measures that are sometimes called engagement and how they're related to performance. One of the things we saw this in our poll is a lot of people are measuring engagement annually, which is a good start. It's definitely better than never. A few people are still not doing it at all. But engagement is something that we can change and improve and develop. So it's something that we want to be measuring regularly, because if we want to improve engagement and improve performance subsequently to that, then we need to make sure we're measuring it, affecting it, and changing it regularly, and we understand what's going on. So in the second point, when we're saying we're not taking the right steps to fix the problem, we tinker at the edges of experience, and we aren't necessarily measuring the right things. So if we're not measuring the right things, we don't know what to change or how to change the right things. One of the examples you might know, some of you might use the EMPS, which is a measure of employee loyalty, not really of engagement. So it's not necessarily measuring exactly the same thing. And if we don't focus on the key issues, then we're not getting the right focus. I'm going to give you a very quick definition on the next slide. So engagement should be measured as a positive state of psychological health and well-being at work. So it's that individual difference of psychological health and well-being. It's not loyalty to the company, it's engagement in your own work. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that, what that means. But you need to make sure that you're looking at work engagement in that context of really focusing on employee well-being, because that has a direct knock-on impact on performance. So I'm going to present some stats from a very large study that was done with over 60,000 people. So this is scientific peer-reviewed research. It's a study combining data from 90 engagement studies. So one of the things that I want to look at with work engagement is making sure we're measuring something that is consistent between different teams, between different departments, between different companies, even different countries around the world. Because if we know we're measuring it in a really clear, specific way that is related to performance wherever you go, whoever you ask, then we know we're measuring the right things, right? We don't want something that maybe just works in one team or that hasn't been validated around different companies and sectors in the world. We want to know if we go into the public sector or the private sector or the military or into a tech company, we're getting consistent results and we know what to measure and how to make it work. So interestingly, this massive study of work engagement looked at a whole bunch of factors that predict performance. And leadership was an important measure. It predicted about 10% of performance, which is really interesting because 10% is a significant impact. If you can make a 10% difference in performance, that's great. But in comparison, individual performance was much more predicted by work engagement. So it's interesting to think how much money is spent on initiatives related to leadership versus how much you're spending on engagement, and maybe getting the balance right there when you see kind of these international factors that are predicted by work engagement much more than leadership. Now, I'm not. Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted there. I was just thinking recently about the amount of money that goes into leadership. It's not just the money, but it's the time and effort. So if you think about all the time spent on leadership development, coaching, going to management workshops, quite rightly, because as we can see here, it does impact performance at the work level. But if you then think about the work engagement specifically, it has like 3 times the impact of that. Is it 3 times the effort going into working engagement and to taking action at an employee manager leadership level compared to what we see going into leadership development.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's good to see it from this perspective, especially to see it from that kind of data-driven perspective. And this is for individual performance. We can see on the next slide the impact on team performance. So what we see here is leadership has a more significant impact on this team performance. And so these are kind of metrics of a positive work environment and collaboration instead of individual performance measures. But still, work engagement is having an even more significant effect here. And this is, again, across companies and countries. So it's really interesting to see how important engagement is in affecting performance.
No, I think that's massively important as well, because in our work, we increasingly hear people talking about team performance. So we've talked for years about individual performance, but how can we leverage team performance? And there's with the agile and squad working, that's becoming really important. So it's interesting to see that working engagement has a equal, well, actually even more of an impact on team performance as well as individual performance.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how profound that effect was. As someone who used to do a lot of leadership research, I was a bit annoyed by that work engagement was such a big predictor, but really interested to see it. So the other point I mentioned earlier is engagement is a better predictor of job performance than other measures, but you have to make sure you're using the right measure. So often what happens is some companies or people use a measure and call it work engagement, but it's not really work engagement. So here are some of the common ones listed here. So job satisfaction is a really common one. Job satisfaction is important, but it's not the same as engagement. So I like to say the difference between satisfaction and engagement is satisfaction is a very passive score, right? You can be happy with it. I can be satisfied because I just had a really good lunch at the company cafe and sit back, I'm very happy with that. But being engaged is being more actively oriented towards the work, right? To be focused on the work, to be getting energy from doing the work instead of a kind of more passive sitting back, being okay with what's going on. So I'll show you later that engagement is much more predictive of performance than satisfaction. Organizational commitment is a really common one. It's an interesting one. So you want to know whether your employees are loyal to the company. That might be something you are testing because it's going to be related to employee turnover and retention. But actually, work engagement is more predictive of the positive outcomes than organizational commitment or loyalty. So this is your eNPS, and some people might find that the NPS is useful for what they want to do, but it's not a measure of employee engagement, of work engagement. The last one is job involvement. This one's used a lot more in the psychological research. We see it in a lot of the research papers. And job involvement is essentially what you do being part of who you are. So there's an old joke about pilots. How do you know that someone's a pilot? They'll tell you. Right? That means like who you are, even when you're outside of work, is you're a pilot, or we see this really commonly in doctors too, right? What your job is, what your job title is part of who you are wherever you are, even if you're not at work. So that's often related to burnout, actually, because if you're really, really involved in your job, but sometimes not engaged in it, then it's really hard to separate the problems of your work from your personal life or to try and kind of get past it. So sometimes job involvement is more related to burnout, which is a negative psychological state, than engagement, which is a positive psychological state.
I think it's really interesting in differentiating between these three things, because often I think they're conflated and people think of them as the same thing. And I was speaking to an organization the other day that's very high profile, the kind of organization that lots of people want to work in. And I was chatting to their HR director, who was saying that measuring loyalty or eNPS for them wouldn't be any use, because everyone would say, yes, it's a fantastic place to work. I'd recommend people working here, but they may be totally disengaged in their job and hating their work or whatever it is. So the two are not the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And as we've seen the research evolve, and now that there's decades of research on work engagement as a specific concept tied to specific performance measures, we know we can move on because it's a better measure than everything that's listed here. And I'm going to show you a bit of research on that, showing the relative importance of it. So you can see the same three factors: job satisfaction, organizational commitment, job involvement. They're all predicting some level of performance, but nowhere near as well as work engagement. So if you want to measure engagement, you should absolutely use this measure of work engagement, not other measures. And if you want to focus on one measure, work engagement is probably the one to focus on because it's going to be most predictive of performance outcomes, those individual performance measures of team metrics. And it's also related to physical and psychological health. So people who are highly engaged have fewer sick days, not because they're being overworked, but because they're getting sick less, because they're physically and psychologically well. And we see much lower turnover, and turnover obviously leads to expense. So reducing turnover because employees are engaged and focused on their work and want to be there is a huge hugely positive influence. So I've mentioned this before, but that ENPS is not a measure of engagement. We're measuring loyalty, which some companies may want to do. That's fine, but it's not the best measure when you're looking at performance. The other one, some of you might use Gallup's measure, the Q12, and that's an interesting one too, because it's a variety of questions that sometimes get around engagement, but aren't necessarily asking engagement questions. So I think one of their questions is, I have a best friend at work, which might be nice to have, but it's not a measure of engagement at all, and it's not going to give you useful data related to performance.
And as we'll come on to later, it's not something that you can actually impact very easily either. How can you affect that?
Exactly, yeah. It's probably not something you can change, whereas engagement really is. So the work we've built on is the Utrecht work engagement measure. So this is probably one of the best scientific, well-validated, well-researched tools. We're talking, decades of research from tens, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, private sector, public sector. So we know it's kind of universally applicable, whether you're in the Netherlands or South Africa or the UK, it doesn't really matter. It's still equally predictive as we see those facts. And so what we wanted to do is adapt the best scientific research that was available, that's been studied and peer reviewed, and see if we could get it a little better. So in a combination of reworking the items, we tested even more items to see exactly how we should measure this in the workplace, and then combining it with tech. So we could make it a little easier, so we can make it more practical to be administering regularly, and integrate it with performance management data, which is ideally how you should be doing it, right? Because we're saying clearly engagement is related to performance, so why not test them together and hopefully try and boost them together. And because we took this measure and our kind of improved version of it, shorter version of it that's more effective, to measure performance in the workplace. And so we originally tested this. We actually tested dozens and dozens of questions, because this is the kind of psychometric background, is we want to test all possible variations, permutations, and make sure we are asking absolutely the right questions in the right way at the right time, to get the most effective data in the most kind of concise and practical way. So we did a few studies with looking at additional items, with testing it with the original Utrecht items and adding more to get the best three questions that were absolutely the most predictive.
Now, a key thing here was to try and see if we could measure work engagement accurately using fewer questions than the Utrecht measure, because one of the key things that was important that you raised and we felt as well is that unless we can measure engagement regularly or continuously, we don't know what the impact is being of the actions that we're taking on the back of it. So it had to be something that we can do regularly. But I know from your research on surveys that if we ask too many questions, it makes it hard to do it regularly.
Yeah, it really does. So if we can minimize the amount of questions we're asking people, then we can get higher engagement, really. But that's one of the really important things too, if we want to measure engagement across departments in the entire company, is if we can make it as efficient and as easy to use for people and as quick to use as possible, we're going to get more people responding. Because one of the other problems I've seen in the past with engagement surveys is you get a clunky survey that has a SurveyMonkey link out that's sent through an email, and most people don't do it. So you're not actually getting representative performance data or engagement data from your organization.
Is there often a sense that if there's too many questions as well, that maybe they'll answer it, but they're not really thinking about it properly? They're just kind of clicking tick box, so you're not getting accurate data?
Yeah, more people will skip it. More people will kind of do the tick box exercise type thing. So the more concise you can make a questionnaire and the more focused you can make it, the better results you're going to get. It's also, I think people really appreciate that, because a lot of people get survey fatigue. And so if you're asking them the questions and you say, we know these are the most efficient way of asking you this, people really appreciate that you're considering their time and their effort and their energy.
Just not to take the conversation back too much, but in terms of maybe people have only just heard of this, the Utrecht Work Engagement Survey, and just want to understand the background and sort of where it comes from and some of the foundations it sits upon. Could you just maybe just unpack that just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I could explain that more, because there's actually a really long history that initially came out of the burnout research. So in 50s, 60s, and 70s, the research in psychology was around kind of negative attributes, and it wasn't so much towards the positive psychology of improving the good performance or engagement. It was about figuring out what causes burnout and what to do about it. So it was, for the time, it was a very interesting approach, and it was kind of saying, when we find problems, we'll figure out how to fix them. But psychology's moved on a lot since then, and we're not just trying to kind of deal with the worst levels of performance. Right now, we're trying to make work a healthier, more effective, more productive place for everyone. So engagement is essentially the opposite of burnout. Right, so it's that kind of positive mental state instead of the negative, exhausted, cynical state. And what we can do is we can boost that, improve engagement, we can kind of potentially mitigate the problems of burnout, because if people are engaged, they're much less likely to be burned out, opposite ends of the spectrum. But we know how to improve that related to performance.
Okay, and this survey has got quite a lot of authority out there within the psychology community.
Oh, absolutely. Scientifically, academically, it's absolutely the best one, no question.
Okay, and from what you've seen, are a lot of some of the engagement surveys, quote unquote, that you're seeing out there today, still looking at that sort of those negative attributes and those sorts of things, like that transition to that more positive frame hasn't been made yet for the most part, or?
Not entirely, or even some of the other surveys or questionnaires don't really get to the heart of engagement. They're asking questions about job resources, right, or demands or managerial support that will affect engagement, but they're not engagement. So if we can get to asking the exact questions that get to the heart of the issue, then we know what to do about it, but we're also making sure we're asking the most efficient questions to get at what exactly is work engagement.
Okay. Okay.
So the next, I'm going to just talk about the 3 factors really quickly. So we've narrowed it down to these 3 questions that measure these 3 factors, which we can directly connect to performance, but also what levers to pull to improve performance and engagement. So energy, that's getting energy from your work, being excited and kind of having that vigor in your work to get up and do it and get it done. So you have that kind of mental energy and resilience as part of engagement. The second one that's really important is purpose. So that's a sense of meaning in your work. You know what you're doing or what you're contributing to the team, why it's important, what effect you're making or having for, it could be clients, it could be customers, it could be people in your team, but it's having a sense of what the value of what you do is. Really, really important for engagement. And it's one of the things that we can boost. And it's sometimes related to, high level corporate plans, strategic plans, mission, vision, values, but that's a sense of purpose in the exact work you're doing. So, this today or this week, you know what you're contributing, what the actual impact of your work is. And it's something that, good managers and leaders should kind of foster and imbue in people, but it's also something that people need to kind of get and develop for themselves, right? You can have an organizational purpose, a team goal, but you need to get up in the morning and say, this is what I want to do today. This is the purpose I want to achieve. So there's kind of a mutual process there in developing engagement. And then the last one is immersion. So that's, some people will have heard the sense of flow, or the idea of being really caught up in your work. So it's the right level of challenging, it's the right level of interesting, and you lose track of time because you're really immersed in the work you're doing. This is an interesting one because it's a easy one for a bad manager to destroy. So if you have a micromanager who is looking over your shoulder every 10 minutes and saying, what are you doing? How are you doing that? Have you done it right? That will completely break down that sense of flow. Whereas if you have a good manager who's giving you the autonomy and the independence, who knows that you're a skilled, educated person who knows what you're doing, gives you the right tools and resources to get the job done, the right support to do it in your own way, kind of autonomously, then that can really foster that sense of immersion.
Or I guess that other thing that can often happen in the workplace, where you've been set in motion on a project or a train of thought, and then suddenly no changes, we're going a different way, and then if that can happen multiple times, I guess that flow or that immersion can drop right off as you just stop connecting with what you're doing.
Exactly, yeah, and it depends on context, right? Too, there's some types of work that is a reality of the work. Stuff changes, stuff happens, things come up, that's fine. But then there's some, if the kind of proper management procedures aren't in place and people are, dropping things or forgetting about projects or completely changing direction for no reason, then that can be incredibly disengaging.
Ian, obviously these factors from your research that you did with us are related to, assessing work engagement. Now, there's a lot of talk and focus, rightly, on workplace well-being at the moment. Do these also have an impact on well-being? Are the two related?
Yeah, directly. So work engagement, as conceptualized by kind of Chef Belli and colleagues at the Utrecht School, is essentially a measure of well-being, psychological health. That's fundamentally what it is psychological health at work, which is why it's so important, because it has a knock-on effect on so many other things. If we can boost engagement, if we can make sure people are psychologically well in the workplace and are enabled to be successful, they are going to be much more successful. They're going to be more productive. They're going to have lower turnover. So that's why it's so important.
It's interesting that it ties in with the conversation I had with the CEO of Investors and People just the other day, and he was talking about, how we're going to tackle well-being is at this worker manager level, and then too many initiatives like yoga and things like that, whilst they're good, but they're not getting to the nub of what's really affecting well-being. It's work, my workload, my energy, my relationship with my colleagues, my manager. That's really this kind of work engagement level, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's fundamentally about the work you're doing, right? You can give people a lot of perks, like a ping pong table and a open tap, beer tap or something in the office. That might make them temporarily happy or satisfied, but it's not the same as work engagement, right? It's not getting at the core of what you're doing at work. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is question 4 about motivators. So this is the other thing that we're asking as a follow-up within the same questionnaire to see what you can do about work engagement. So there's 12 options here that employees can say what is most important to them at work. So these are the levers you can pull to help boost engagement, right? So you can see that if people are saying they have very low autonomy in their workplace, that is one of the things that's going to hugely affect work engagement. And it's something that you want to know about because it's potentially something that can be changed. When we look at some of the other factors like more recognition for achievements, often that's really connected with purpose, right? So if you have a manager who's regularly saying, thanks for doing this, you did a really good job, here's what you added to the team, or here's how we used your work, or here's what this has contributed, that's something that can really help to boost that sense of purpose and boost work engagement. So that you can see with these if there's factors that are lacking, if there's factors you can improve. And you can also look at these as long-term trends, right? Because if you're doing some sort of organizational change initiative, you might be saying, we need to give people more autonomy. This is something that needs to happen across a department or across the whole company, maybe across a team. So it's really useful to be able to see these, and then Stuart's going to show you later, you get this kind of dashboard results showing the breakdown of these. Another one is improved career development opportunities. So that's kind of related to growth and development. So that's going to affect engagement overall. And so you'll be able to see kind of trends and patterns in what you can do to affect work engagement. So this is a really useful one to include.
I guess the key point here is, yes, we need to measure work engagement accurately, but we also need to have an understanding of what we can do about it.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's the reason we've separated it here. So we've got that core component of work engagement saying, here's what it is. And then you've got this next set of things. Here's the stuff you can do about it. So the main takeaways there, I really, really want to reinforce that there's a strong scientific and psychological evidence for work engagement. So this is really good science based on decades of research, with people around the world. So we know that there's a really clear link between performance and work engagement, and there's a huge amount of peer-reviewed scientific evidence to support that. So I think that's really important because really ultimately, if we want to improve work engagement or performance, we should be going to the data and saying, we know that this works. So I think that scientific background is really important, and that it predicts performance. So we know that there is a very clear, very direct link. If you want to be improving performance, work engagement is one thing that does it. It's one of the most important things that does it. And it's much better than other measures. So those are the things like employee loyalty. Work engagement is much stronger than that. And the other key is that we can increase work engagement. So there's some things at work that we might select for, like you might select employees for personality traits or intelligence or something, but those aren't things that you can change. Once you've hired a high potential person, you need to know what you can do to develop and improve their performance. And work engagement is absolutely one of those factors.
And I think that's a really key point, because if we go back to the beginning of the conversation around the issue we have with productivity and performance, if we're going to increase it and use engagement as a lever, it has to be a form of engagement that we can actually do something about.
Exactly, yeah.
Which segues nicely into my next section, which is talking about meaningful action. But before I get into that, just a reminder to please pose your questions. I'm sure after some of the things that Ian said, some questions will be forming in your mind. So get those in, and we'll start getting into the questions towards the end of the webinar. I wanted to bring this up because one of the things that I've often sensed and heard from talking to employees and managers is say, well, we've done these surveys, but nothing happened on the back of it. And this was actually reiterated by a study that Forbes did that found that 58% of organizations took no meaningful action on the back of engagement surveys. And that was around 3,000 organizations that took part in that. So it's clearly a major issue here. Now, part of the problem that's causing this, and I certainly found this when I worked in HR, is that HR, because they're responsible for capturing the engagement data, they are often unfairly expected to be the ones who need to fix it. And that's just not possible, because from what we've heard you talk about, Ian, what science tells us about engagement is that the things that impact it the most are the job itself, the work, and the working relationship with the manager. Now, problems in these areas, they need to be fixed at the work level, at the employee and the manager level. HR can't solve those problems themselves. Sure, they can influence and they can guide and they can coach, but they can't solve those problems that happen at the work level. So if we want to improve engagement, everybody needs to take responsibility, including employees and managers. So to make this happen, we need to do two things. Firstly, we need to put engagement data in the hands of employees and managers. Now, in many organizations that I've come across, detailed survey results are only shared with the senior leaders. Sometimes summary results might be shared with employees or managers, and sometimes nothing at all. But if we want to help employees and managers to fix problems at the work engagement level, they can't fix something that they're not conscious of or aware of. So we need to help employees to understand their own levels of engagement, and also to help managers to understand engagement issues specifically within their team, not just the overall results in the organization. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we need to help people to understand how to take action on the back of the data, because that's not always easy and it's not always obvious. And we can do this at the most kind of simplistic way of running sessions for staff on how to interpret engagement results, what the potential causes of low engagement might be, and also giving suggestions on what they could do to work together to improve it. Now, obviously, there's a time investment here, and we know that time is critical in organizations, but some of this can now actually be automated through new engagement technology, which can interpret engagement results and give employees and team leaders suggested actions that they can take themselves. And we'll show you what that can look like in a bit. Now, Ian, I know you have a view on this.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to give people the opportunity to be engaged. You know, this isn't just a top-down initiative that you can do and you can say, okay, it's our plan in the next 6 months, everyone has to be more engaged, you're going to do this. It has to be something that you give people the tools and resources and support to individually be able to boost their own engagement. And it's kind of a process and a conversation to have with your managers or among your team about what could make you more engaged. But it's something that every level has to be improved, you know, from individual employees to senior leadership has to buy into it.
Yeah. Now, if we are actually then empowering action to be taken at that employee manager level, then what that allows HR to be able to do is, instead of being the people that are responsible for having to fix everything, they can then stand back and look at engagement data at a macro level to inform the organizational initiatives that they need to focus on. It could be well-being or it could be leadership capability. And they can also identify which area of the organizations need the most support from themselves. So what we've got really here is a model of shared responsibility. And you can see in this slide, each of the 4 key sets of players, this is employees, managers, HR, and senior leadership, they're all taking action, but only on the things that they can directly influence. So we're avoiding wasted time and effort across the board. And what this results in is everybody seeing that action is being taken, which is really important to prevent that survey fatigue that you talked about, or even cynicism setting in around nothing ever changes around here. Now, at the employee and manager level, where high work engagement is key, some of the actions that will actually improve it might include talking about engagement issues during one-to-one check-in sessions, ensuring people's goals are meaningful and that they're receiving regular recognition and feedback in order to stay motivated. Now, what we can see here is that these are traditional things that would fall under the realm of performance management rather than employee engagement. So really, the two are intrinsically linked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't really look at one without the other.
Yeah, so I think it's a critical point, and it's part of the theme of this webinar, is that if we want to improve employee engagement, we have to consider engagement and performance management together, and they need to work together hand in hand. Now, there's a problem here because in most organizations, they're managed completely separately and often by completely different people in the HR function. And that's typically been because different systems have been used for each in the past, but that's also now changing. So we have an opportunity here because technology is available now that can manage engagement and performance within the same system. Now, to understand how we can do this, what I wanted to do was a quick recap on what best practice performance management looks like, so we can see where engagement actually fits into this. So I'm just going to quickly go over this diagram. So this is the Clear Review continuous performance management model, and it's based around what we call the check-in, which is a regular future-focused performance and development conversation, which typically would take place between every 1 and every 3 months. Under this model, the traditional fixed annual objectives and personal development plans are replaced by agile performance and development goals, which can be updated and changed at any time. And then feedback, instead of being saved up for annual reviews, is being given in real time as events happen, using tech as the enabler. And then when it comes to assessing performance for pay or succession purposes, this is decoupled from the developmental side of performance management, those check-ins, and it's done as a separate exercise in a really quick and simple way, again, using tech as an enabler, so we're not having to do the big time-consuming annual appraisal at the end of the year. So that's the model for continuous performance management. So where does engagement engagement fit in here? Well, we can integrate engagement by measuring work engagement regularly using the 4 questions that Ian explained, and then reflect back the results and suggested actions in a confidential way to both the employees and the managers, so that they can feed that thinking into their check-in conversations. They can feed that thinking into their development planning and also in their goal setting to get that meaning and purpose. So let's have a look to see how this works in practice using technology. So what you're seeing here is the homepage of Clear Review, which employees are using to manage their performance and development on an ongoing basis. Now, the majority of Clear Review users are going into the system at least monthly to do some kind of performance-related activity, such as booking a check-in conversation, updating a goal or action, or giving some feedback. So while they're in the system, we can periodically ask them those 3 work engagement questions that Ian introduced, as well as the 4th question around motivation factors. And by doing it this way, we don't have to keep emailing them to ask them to complete surveys. What we're asking is just a few seconds of their time while they're already in the system to help them understand their work engagement and the motivation factors. So it's very much what is often being referred to as doing things in the flow of work. I'm doing things in a way that feels natural and non-intrusive to me. Now, what's really interesting is once we've understood the engagement and motivation factors, we can give the employees suggested actions that they can take based on their answers automatically, encouraging them to feed that thinking into their objective planning or their next check-in conversation. And the system can do this automatically. Now, where this becomes even more powerful is where the organization customizes these example prompts that you're seeing on the screen here for their specific organizational initiative. So as a really simple example of this, if someone is scoring very low on energy, as Ian mentioned, it's the potential sign of burnout. So the system could automatically suggest that they speak to a mental health first aider, or even provide them with a link to book an appointment, or it could direct them to an organization's employee assistance program. In my experience of working in HR, those programs are set up and not used enough. So if we can give people specific prompts to do things themselves based on the engagement questions and their answers, we can get them to be taking some action and some ownership themselves, rather than expecting HR to say, well, you need to sort this out for me. Now, obviously, we can't just put the onus on the employee here. So what we need to do is aggregate the results up at a team and an organizational level to see where the issues are within the organization. Now, where there are issues that are evident, you can then use the system to send out a follow-up, more detailed survey to understand the root cause of the problems. But a key thing here is we're not doing that kind of spray and pray, giving a load of questions to everybody in the organization, hoping that they might be relevant. I don't think that's something you've seen happen in the past, Ian.
Yeah, and I think the advantage of this system is it makes it so clear and for employees to see what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they're getting back from it almost immediately. Well, immediately in this case. And so it's giving you that opportunity to make sure it's an ongoing conversation, like with performance management. And that's so important in engagement, just to make sure that you are taking some action, because, you know, like Stuart was saying, if you ask people some questions and then do nothing about it, that's incredibly disengaging. But if people can see the results of their work, or of what questions they're filling out, or how they're participating in the system, that's really important part of kind of the ongoing continuous improvement.
And I guess they'll see the point in doing it again next time.
Exactly.
And if you want to ask people to do this regularly, they have to understand the purpose of why they should do that, and they're seeing something back.
Yeah.
Now, when you start putting performance and engagement data together, that's where I think that things become even more interesting. Now, one of our customers, CSM, which is a global marketing and branding agency, did this recently, and what they found was those employees using Clear Review had consistently higher engagement scores around the subjects of management and feedback. So what this demonstrates is it's not just engagement that impacts performance, but good performance management can also positively impact engagement. Now, this is all new area of data that we're uncovering here. So what I'm hoping that we'll see over time, once we start putting more of this data together, is this kind of flywheel effect where engagement is impacting performance and good performance management is impacting engagement. Do you think that's something that we could start to see?
Yeah, absolutely. We would see some sort of virtuous cycle like that. And then the advantage of tracking it too is your organization will know what was effective and what initiatives did boost engagement. So you can roll it out to other departments or other teams, or make sure you're kind of using the best practice and rolling it out to continually improve performance and engagement and get that upward cycle.
Okay, Dan, back over to you for another poll question.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to get into some questions and answers, so do keep them coming in over the next 30 seconds. But before that, we just want to do a final poll and ask the question, how easy is it for you to align engagement and performance metrics within your organization? Is that an easy thing to do? You can do it, but it's not easy, or it's basically impossible. So again, we'll just have a bit of a pause while we get those responses coming through.
I'd be really interested to see how far people have got with data, because I know that's something that's evolving at a very significant pace. Certainly we read a huge amount in the HR press about data analytics, but one of the things that I find when we're talking to HR professionals on a day-to-day basis, that they're still finding getting good data hard.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not in the right format, or it's in different sources, and it's
two different systems. One does performance, one does engagement, but it's hard to get any overlap between them.
Yeah, and there are things that we can use to bring those together if they are in different systems like BI, like Power BI and these like BI type tools. But it takes data analysts to be able to do that typically. The other issue with engagement data, if it's in a separate system, is it's anonymous and it's confidential. So how can you relate that to actually someone's performance if you don't know who they are?
Okay, so we've got a strong response there. Only 8% said that was something easy to do. 61% said it's achievable but difficult, with the remaining 31% saying nope, basically impossible.
Yeah, so majority trying to get spreadsheet data and kind of pull things together from different data sources by the sounds of it.
Or our first 8% who don't collect engagement data.
Yes,
they would struggle to do that.
Yeah, exactly. You have to have the data to be able to put it together with the performance metrics.
Great. Okay, well, we're just going to move into a Q&A period. So let's see how many of these we can get through.
Just before we do that, we were going to sum up, or do you want to do that after we've had a few questions? Maybe we can sum up after we've had a few questions.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Great. Okay. So, I have a question here. Energy has been shown to vary throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year. There are a number of factors outside of work, for example, a child that doesn't sleep, know the feeling, that can result in energy faltering throughout the day. How do we overcome these external impacts in an index that's designed to measure only work-related factors?
That is a perfect question, and thank you for asking that, because this does specifically measure workplace energy. So we're talking about that kind of psychological energy, that focus on work. It's not so much going to be affected by other factors, or it's not physical energy or tiredness. It's not energy because you've just been to the gym and you're worn out, or kids kept you up all night. So that's why we've had to test so many variations and permutations of these questions to make sure we're specifically getting to that.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Please, can you address how organizations can develop the trust needed to allow open and honest feedback on these engagement surveys?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of important aspects here. One is to emphasize confidentiality. They have to absolutely know that it's anonymous, and that's part of why we have to work hard on getting the employee to raise actions to bring their engagement issues to their conversations with their manager, because we can't give the manager that data directly about individuals. So we have to empower the individuals to do that. So that's one. And I think the second point here is what we've already covered about, that we need to give people visibility that things are happening on the back of it. So I need to trust that you're going to do something about this. Now, you often get one or two shots at doing that. After that, then people's trust is going to go away. What's your thoughts, Ian?
Yeah, I think we've got another question here that I want to ask.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's keep them moving along. The Christian et al. Paper was published 9 years ago. Does that still remain relevant in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. And one of the reasons that paper is a bit older is because these meta-analyses take a substantial amount of time to do. So there has been a lot of engagement research published since then on the measure, but that's one of the best meta-analyses from that time. But there's a consistent amount of research since then. Okay. And we've got an ebook that has some of the more recent engagement research. So I suggest you look at that. We're going to send out to you, so that might be interesting.
Great. Okay. Another question we have is, and we did kind of get into this, but how would you recommend that HR manage engagement and performance together? So maybe it's just revisiting some of the.
Yeah, so obviously the two are related, and they are not two distinct sets of activities. They need to be thought of as one. So there's a couple of things here, is going away and thinking about your processes that you do for both, and say, instead of thinking them separately, how can we think of them as one continuous flow? So I gave some examples here of reflecting back engagement data to individuals and encouraging them to bring that up, their check-in conversations, thinking about how we feedback results to managers and how that flows into their team meetings, into their individual one-to-ones, into their objective and development setting. The two are linked, so we have to think about how we can manage them as one separate process. So firstly, certainly the person who's responsible should be the same, or the team that's responsible should be the same. And from an employee perspective, they should really be in the same system, because it will feel like it's integrated, it feels like it's continuous. If they have to go to two separate places, it's not going to feel teed up.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of slightly more sort of on the technical side questions. So with a similar thread. So the system indicates that the answers are confidential. What does that mean? Confidential between employee and manager? And similarly, the next question is, can managers pull off reports for their own teams for engagement and for performance and development and that kind of thing? So
yeah, so confidential here means anonymous. So what we can't do is give managers the engagement data of specific individuals. That we should reflect back to the individual and encourage them to be talking about it. Now, we can't guarantee that they will always do that. There may be trust issues with the manager, but we should be encouraging the employee to do that, and that's what the system is trying to prompt to do. From a manager perspective, we can aggregate the data across a number of different individuals, and you work with us to define what the minimum should be on that, Ian. Perhaps if you can talk about what safe levels psychologically to aggregate data.
Yeah, and we use the same guidelines that the NHS would use to protect patient data, to make sure that when you're looking at team or organizational scores, you're not able to pick out individual level data from that. So if people don't want to share their individual scores, then it's not provided by the system. You get that, the manager would get a team or a departmental level overview.
Okay, well, look, there's a couple more questions. I know that there's some questions from some clear review customers in here to do with the new functionality on our system. For transparency's sake, the employee engagement aspect of our technology is being launched in February or early March. So that's what you can keep an eye on that, and we will be in touch with you more about that. I think we'll probably wrap it up for questions just at the moment. So if we wanted to go through that little wrap up to bring us into land, then that would be great.
Sure. So we've obviously covered a lot today. So I just wanted to cover 3 or 4 of the things that are the key points that I'd like people to take away. So firstly, it's about asking the right engagement questions in the right way. So looking at work engagement and measuring it regularly. Secondly, we need to share responsibility for engagement. HR can't improve engagement by themselves. We've talked about that. Thirdly, we need to make sure that we take meaningful action on the results. And if we want to improve engagement and performance, much of that action does need to be taken at the employee and management level. So we need to empower people to do that. And finally, we need to ensure that performance management and engagement work together. What we thought would be helpful is to just have a few things that you could take away and things that you could actually start doing in your organization. So we've come up with 4 things. Echoing what we've just said, we really recommend that you measure work engagement. As Ian said, it's the most scientifically validated measure of engagement. Empower your people to take meaningful action by putting their data in their hands and helping them to understand the actions that they can take themselves. Start thinking about how you can manage performance and engagement together as a single process rather than a separate set of activities. And the last action is leveraging technology to enable each of these things to happen.
Great. Okay, well, look, that brings us into land. So thanks so much, Stuart. Thank you, Ian. As we say, we will get these slides and the recording out to you. And we also have an ebook that unpacks some of this in a little bit more detail that we will send out on a follow-up email. Do please feel free to get in touch or add us on LinkedIn. And we look forward to meeting you for another webinar in a couple of months from now. Many thanks. Over and out.